You know, the longer you work around missing person cases, the more you realize the first story you're told is almost never the one that matters. It's the follow-up stories, the ones that shift slightly, the ones patched together with odd details that start to tell you what's really going on. And right from the start with this case, something just didn't sit right. Let's go back to that snake on the porch situation. Now look, I've heard plenty of strange stories over the years, but that one stuck out like a sore thumb. It wasn't just unusual, it felt performative, a bit too convenient. And when you see a peculiar detail like that early in an investigation, you don't necessarily throw the whole case into question, but you do mark it down as a possible signal. A clue that maybe there are one or two more strange explanations woven into the larger fabric. Whenever someone leans on tall tales to explain away tension, confrontation, or suspicious behavior, it creates what I like to call narrative noise. Excessive noise is rarely innocent. Sometimes it's just nerves. But other times, well, it's a sign that the person's trying a bit too hard to steer you toward a particular version of events. And that brings me to Jess and Ronnie. Because while we're all talking about little Gus, a lot of people haven't noticed something equally unsettling. Two other people effectively vanished from public view right around the same time. Jess and her little boy, Ronnie. So today, I want to walk through a bit of a thought experiment. Not a conclusion, not an accusation. Just the kind of mental exercise you do when you're trying to see whether the puzzle pieces might fit together differently than you first assumed. Do we actually know where Jess and Ronnie are? Let's look at the basics. Do we know where Ronnie is? No. Do we know where Jess is? Also no. We know where Josh is. He's visible. He's working. He's in a stable environment, family-owned property, employed, around people. And you'd think, during a crisis like this, that the child's mother and sibling would be nearby, or at the very least somewhat present in the public space. Not for show, but because that's usually what families do when tragedy hits. They circle the wagons. But here, that hasn't happened, and the silence, especially from Jess, has been extraordinary. Now look, I'm not saying she's doing anything wrong by staying quiet. People cope differently. But in missing child cases, mothers almost never disappear from sight unless something major is happening behind the curtain. It's just not typical behavior. It would make sense for Jess and Ronnie to be staying with Josh. Anyone would think that. But if that were the case, I genuinely believe we'd have seen Jess at least once. Not an interview, not a breakdown, just a sighting, a mention, a neighbor's comment, something, and we haven't. Now, I'll be straight with you. This rests on a few assumptions. The first is that Jess left the station early on. The second is that she's not living with Josh now. Both could be wrong, absolutely. But if they're right, well, then we're dealing with a third, more interesting possibility. Why would she leave? Why stay silent? I'd really like to know when Jess left the station, if she did, because her absence is strange without context. We don't know what she's told investigators. We don't know what they've told her. And we don't know what they know. But as an investigator, silence from a parent in a missing child case is a massive data point. Not proof, not guilt, but data. This situation reminds me a bit of the Sullivan siblings case. Their mother also slipped out of view and stayed out. And everyone kept asking, is she hiding? Is she being protected? Is she in denial? Or does she know something? That's the uncomfortable question that hangs around in cases like these. Silence is often protective, but the real question is who or what it's protecting. Now, look, families are complex. Every home has its own dynamics, and outsiders rarely see the real picture. But actions, consistent long-term actions, tend to reflect the truth more reliably than words. So when a mother leaves early, doesn't return, doesn't speak publicly, doesn't even release a simple statement of hope or grief, that's unusual. Very unusual. And this is where experience starts whispering in your ear, because I can't remember the last time both parents of a missing child were this disconnected from the public search effort. It's not typical human behavior. You don't need a psychology background to know that when someone doesn't look for a missing person, sometimes it's because they believe, deep down, they already know the outcome. I'm not saying that's the case here, but it's a possibility an investigator would consider. Did anyone besides Josh search for Gus that night? Here's something else we don't have clarity on. Did Shannon search immediately? Did Jess search? Did Ronnie? Did anyone besides Josh actively go looking? We just don't know. And that lack of transparency is another strange part of this case. Normally, early search efforts are full of detail. Who looked, where they looked, what time they started, what route they took. Even if the information isn't public, you at least get a sense that those efforts happened. Here, it's murky. And murky details are often where the truth hides. The search radius problem. I want to talk about something a viewer mentioned recently. They said the initial 2-kilometer radius was too small. They suggested the kid could have traveled much farther. All right, let's break that down. It sounds reasonable on the surface. Kids wander. Kids run. Kids follow familiar figures, but the time of day matters, the terrain matters, the visibility matters, the temperature matters. A child might chase after a parent, sure, but how far would they really keep going in those conditions? And here's the key point: wandering leaves evidence, footprints. Scuff marks, a slide in loose dirt, bent grass, a broken twig, something, anything. Investigators didn't find a single print even 1 kilometer from the house, not one. Not even partial tread. Nothing indicating he walked 1 meter, 10 meters, 50 meters. Now, you're free to believe he wandered 5 kilometers or 10 or 20. But if we can't prove he walked one, the theory becomes extremely difficult to defend. You can stretch a theory, you cannot stretch the evidence. So where does this leave us? The disappearance of Jess and Ronnie from public view isn't a small detail. It's a major piece of behavioral information. And in investigation work, behavior is often more revealing than anything found in a notebook or a statement. Right now, we know this. Jess isn't speaking. She isn't being seen. She isn't standing with Josh. She isn't participating publicly in the search. Ronnie isn't visible either, and when two people close to a missing child remove themselves from the narrative at the exact moment they'd normally be most present, that absence becomes almost as loud as a confession. Again, not guilt, not accusation, but a signal that something behind the scenes isn't adding up. Maybe Jess is overwhelmed, maybe she's being shielded, maybe she's somewhere quiet, trying to hold herself together, or maybe, just maybe, she believes something she isn't ready to share. Whatever the reason, the longer the silence continues, the harder it becomes to ignore. Look, I could take this further, but the truth is, time will sort out which of these questions matter and which don't. Cases like this always reveal themselves eventually. The dust settles, the noise fades, and what's left usually makes sense. But for now, the absence of Jess and Ronnie is one of the biggest unanswered questions hanging over this case. And it's a question worth watching closely. If you've stuck with me this far, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know, and it keeps you in the loop as we follow this case and others like it. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.